Today, I've been asked to talk with you about the ways that we can utilize research to help improve policy and practice and decision-making at all levels of the system. And the need for that is never more important than it has been. The pandemic, our racial reckoning as a country, all of this has brought about unprecedented disruption in our education systems. At the same time, that evidence is really under attack in many decision-making spaces. And so now how to think about getting evidence into the system to make it usable is critical, and it's right at the central mission of PACE. So today I'm going to talk with you about the work that PACE has been engaged in since the pandemic descended as a way to both share our journey, but also our theory about how to achieve maximum impact. But first, let me tell you a little bit about PACE for those of you that don't know. Our mission is to improve education policy and practice and advance equity through evidence. And we do that really by sitting at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. So the way that we see it, our magic happens when we can really connect all of these different actors and different kinds of evidence to make the most out of decision making. How do we do this? We do it through bringing evidence to bear on the most critical issues facing our state, making research evidence accessible, and leveraging partnership and collaboration to drive system improvement. Now, we work across many different topic areas, largely because we operate as a very extensive research network. We're formally a partnership of 5 California universities, the one you see here on the slide, but we work with scholars at universities and research centers all across the state and all across the country. So essentially, because our mission is to be responsive and because we work with this very extensive network of researchers, we were able to be very responsive and immediately pivot to meet the needs of the pandemic, of decision makers during the pandemic. And so what I want to talk with you a little bit is about what that looked like throughout the twists and turns of the pandemic. So a little bit about that before we get into the timeline. We all came together very early on to think about what our approach would be to getting evidence in front of people in such an unprecedented and chaotic and novel circumstance. We had never been in this circumstance as a field. And so what we needed to do was think about how can our research be different to produce the kinds of evidence that we need to produce for this context. So we produced 4 different kinds of research during the pandemic. The first is around predictive analytics, modeling the expected impact of the pandemic based on prior data. We also consolidated existing evidence and extrapolated that evidence to inform decision-making in the short and longer term. So we may have never had evidence about this particular, how we implement educational approaches in this particular context, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from prior research on different topics. We also conducted and conduct original data collection and analysis to understand problems of performance, to document implementation of new approaches, and to document promising practices. And then finally, analyzing and proposing possible policy options and assessing the benefits, risks, and costs of those different approaches. So I don't think I need to go too into detail about how crazy the past year and a half has been from an education policy perspective. Throughout the past 18 months, it has felt like every week there's a new huge development that completely changes the context of schooling and of the student experience and of policy. And so we really have tried at all of these different points to be very responsive to the needs of the decision makers at all levels of the system, both kind of giving folks what they need right now, but also trying to sense, if it takes 3 months to produce a policy brief or 6 months to produce a big new program of work, what's the kind of evidence that people are going to need in hand at that point? So responsiveness, but also trying to get in front of what people are asking for now to get them what they're going to need at exactly the right time, which has been very challenging and I think also very rewarding. So ultimately, over the course of the pandemic, we've produced 39 publication sets, which consist of policy briefs, working papers, practice briefs, and reports. 32 commentaries, which are shorter form ways to get research evidence out into the field. And those are very easily read and get a lot of visibility. And we've worked with over 110 authors. So lots of people have contributed to PACE work over the past year and a half. And so I'm going to talk about a few different buckets of work that we've engaged in. The first is around school funding. So as soon as the pandemic hit, we knew that education funding was in danger, and we began sounding the alarm early via research publications, commentaries, op-eds, media outreach, and events. This started with modeling the expected hit to California's education budget as a result of the economic crisis. And some of our first work on this came out in a webinar that was heavily covered by the media, that was very well attended, and that ultimately played a really important role in creating some public discussion around how bad budget cuts would be for California's schools at this critical crisis moment. The governor was proposing a 10% reduction in funding that, after our research came out and was central in some of these conversations, was at least transformed to deferrals so that districts weren't experiencing a cut in the middle of this incredible crisis that was so hard for them to navigate. But then as the economy kind of recovered, and so we moved into continuing to work on the funding issue, but in a much different way. So now we were raising up research evidence about the cost of recovery, the cost of responsiveness to the impact, and laying the groundwork for making the case that we needed additional funding in our education systems to be able to recover from the pandemic sufficiently. And for those of you that don't work in California, school funding here is a topic that is very front and center, because our schools have been historically underfunded, which put us in a really dangerous position when the pandemic hit. So now we're in a completely different context. We have an unprecedented level of new and one-time funding from the state and federal government. And so we've shifted to helping districts think about how to implement and spend those dollars and how to get in front of this fiscal cliff. So the next topic that we covered and continue to cover is the measurement of student learning, engagement, and well-being. Early on in the pandemic, we started making the case for measurement and transparency in reporting about how students were engaging with school, how they were learning, how they were faring in both social, emotional, and mental health ways. And then we began predicting what the impact of the pandemic might be, and then monitoring the impact of the pandemic based on interim assessments. And this work has been highly influential, covered extensively in the state and national media, and also represented in legislative hearings and in budget documents here in California as a case for how and why we're making particular investments. We did a lot of work consolidating the evidence on distance learning. This was one topic where I think it was really critical that we were talking with people who know about distance learning, but then extrapolating. How do we take what we know about good teaching and learning and distance learning and try to build a framework for how we can implement some of those practices in this current context? Another area where we've done a lot of work is in organizing schools to support students' diverse needs. And this is a place where we've produced a lot of work because, to the theme of today's event, how we structure our systems is so influential in how students experience and engage with learning opportunities. So this started with research on what we know about staggered schedules so that we could help inform that conversation about school reopening, but also about how we lead schools in a context of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The importance of making sure we organize for outdoor time, play, and recess as we bring students back to school, because those things are so critical for student engagement, both with each other and with learning opportunities. And then, as we're thinking now about how we rebuild our systems, have raised up evidence around multi-tiered systems of support, staffing to support diverse and critical student needs, community schools, and expanded learning opportunities. So in some ways, all of this work had really culminated in a big project that we released in the spring that we called Reimagine and Rebuild, which started out with a question: would it be possible to create a North Star vision for what schools should look like in California? that was grounded in research and aligned with the hopes and dreams of parents, families, teachers, administrators, and communities. That was the vision when we launched this project with two partners, Californians for Justice and the Education Trust West. Ultimately, we engaged in a process that included over 40 California-based organizations, and research and practice and policy were swirling in the same spaces as we were engaged in this process. We wanted to document what kinds of changes do we collectively want to see in our schools, and then flesh those ideas out with the research evidence and put a little bit of a framework around if students and parents and teachers are saying, this is what we need, what does the research say about how we can implement that, and whether or not it would be effective or in which conditions it might be effective. But also we could bring the research in to help strengthen their own perceptions about what that could and should look like. Ultimately, this vision was advocated for by over 40 organizations, as I said, that included the California Teachers Association, the Parent Teacher Association, the administrators, the school board, and many parent, educator, teacher, and student organizations. And so I want to talk for a second about this framework that we all put together, because it was a moment of, I think, real victory for evidence, but also real optimism in our system, because there was so much agreement about what we want to see for our schools. So this plan has five primary tenets. The first is centering relationships within schools. And the way to do that is by connecting one-on-one with every student and every family, creating dedicated time and space for relationship building and re-engagement, and implementing positive and restorative discipline practices. The second is addressing whole child needs. The only way to serve students appropriately is to fully understand both their needs and their assets and develop an individualized plan that helps to be able to advance, help them achieve their ultimate vision and thrive. And so this includes screenings and formative assessments, and ultimately the creation of a plan for each child. But in order to implement that plan, we have to strengthen staffing and partnerships within schools. California schools are not well equipped to be able to serve a diverse set of student needs and to personalize learning. And so we provide recommendations for how to do that. Nothing will matter if we don't, in every classroom, strive to make teaching and learning relevant and rigorous, and to be able to arm students with the tools to be able to explore the issues that matter most to them, and to center things, all of the curriculum, within a vision of racial equity. And finally, we have to empower teams at all levels of the system to be able to lead and implement this work and to engage in cycles of continuous improvement. What we're laying out here, while it had very broad consensus, is not at all the way our schools are organized currently. And so in order to achieve this vision would require a different way of thinking about the leadership within schools. As part of this work, we put together what we call the forties, which is a framework for thinking about how to make investments. And I'm not going to go into this really in detail here, but it includes making and buying time, organizing for time, hiring talent, providing sufficient training for educators and staff, and purchasing technology, supplies, and materials. And so within this context, we also provided a framework for thinking about how to allocate some of this money. So our vision here, to borrow a quote attributed to Henry Ford, was, if everyone is moving forward together, then success takes care of itself. Our vision was, if we can have this North Star that everyone agrees to, then when everyone is marching forward and doing their work, whatever it looks like, we know we're moving in the same direction. And so at the end of this process, we had a big convening with the representatives from these 40 organizations, and they all said, here are the actions that I'm going to take to move this forward. And it was very exciting, because with such diversity of actors, you have people who are, we'll be presenting this to teachers, we'll be advocating for specific budget actions, we'll be advocating at the local level for district interventions and for district actions. And so our vision felt like we were kind of on the right track. And we played a role in making sure that evidence had a seat at the party. So I know that PACE is a unique organization with an infrastructure that is built to do just what I've described and a robust network of researchers that we can draw from. So I want to abstract what I've learned about impact in this past year and a half and as my time as executive director of PACE to share some lessons that I think might be more generalizable to thinking about the challenge that we have ahead. The first is to start with the right questions. I think sometimes in education, we have this vision of how research impacts policy and practice that looks something like this. I study something that's very interesting and high quality, and then we think about how it impacts policy and practice. But really what I've found is that a model that looks more like this is more effective. The needs of decision makers at all levels of the system help you generate your research questions. And in turn, you're doing research that is more applicable to the needs of folks in those critical positions. And then they're primed to use it. So this iterative process, making sure your research is aligned from the start with the needs of folks on the ground is a critical piece to having impact. The second is to have an explicit theory of change. A lot of times in academic work, I think we have the tendency to talk about policymakers or school district administrators as an abstraction. But in my experience, these are all people working within structures, working within processes, and working under particular constraints. And understanding how and why your research would prompt somebody to behave differently helps you think about where those levers are and how you can formulate both relationships and outreach strategies that might really change things. And whether that's in a district that you care about, in a community, at a state or federal level, being able to articulate where your research fits in is very important. The third piece, make your research accessible. We've done a lot of focus groups with policymakers and practitioners over the past few years. And one of the things they always tell us is, I won't read it if it takes me more than 2 minutes. It has to have pictures or be in a video format. And that can be a really daunting task as academics. We write research reports, but they're very clear on this. And so we do minute-and-a-half videos. We do infographics that distill our work into the most brief and accessible format possible. And we do a lot of outreach, which I'll talk about in just a second. Outreach and communications are not an afterthought in our work. They're essential to our theory of action. So I want to share with you how we think about that. In PACE's outreach, we think of how we engage with various audiences as a pyramid. Especially in today's day and age, general outreach to a broad audience is really, really important because there's so much noise out in the world that it's hard to get any real estate for research ideas. So we do, at the bottom of the pyramid, a lot of general outreach writing like op-eds and media engagement, whether that's on radio, podcasts, talking with reporters, so that the broadest set of folks can have access to our ideas. We also do video and audio products that we share throughout our own channels, like our newsletter and social media. For a more specific audience, we hold webinars or targeted outreach to stakeholder groups. We have events in Sacramento since they're such a key audience for our work. And then at the very top of the pyramid, we have one-to-one outreach. And so this is where, for each of our pieces, when we have this theory of action about how our work fits in, we make an effort to identify those critical folks who will make an action based on our research. And we have strong and deep relationships with those folks and try to be as responsive as possible because we know that they'll act when they get our research as well. Next, center the voices of those closest to the work. So often when we're talking about improvement in policy and practice, we're talking to policymakers or school system leaders. But those people don't always have they do not often have the same perspective as when you're talking to students or families. And so being able to raise up the voices of people who are experiencing changes in the system or dysfunction in the system is a critical role that we can play as researchers to helping to push in some of that change. And then finally, or not quite finally, work in partnership. Throughout the pandemic, we really doubled down on our partnerships even more than we ever had before for many reasons. I think one is that there are dissemination type partners that you can work with and elevate all of each other's research, right? So there were a big group of organizations that came together during the pandemic and kind of coordinated work so that we could say, if one organization is doing a lot of work on this topic, then we'll lean on your good work and not duplicate effort. We'll work on something else and you can disseminate what we're working on. And that was so critical during this period where we just needed so much evidence production. We also work very closely with folks at the district level and within networks of districts. They both help us make sense of what's happening on the ground and understand what those right questions are. And then also they help to disseminate and act on our research once we produce it. The final lesson that I'll share with you is to stay close to the evidence, but to trust your expertise. There were so many opportunities during the pandemic where our folks in our network were being asked to speak outside of anything they had explicitly studied. And I think that can be a little bit nerve-wracking for a lot of us who really our stock in trade is research. I know this because I've studied it. But in this novel context, nobody had studied the context that we were currently in. And so you, as someone who has studied something for years or your entire career, you know more about the path forward than many other people, even if you don't really know how to proceed, right? And so we as a network, I think really had to build a different kind of understanding about the role that we could play in policy conversations. So where are we now? In our Rebuild and Reimagine process, we really felt such an incredible optimism. It felt like everyone was on the same page and we had huge wins. The budget in California was unprecedentedly large. It was aligned very tightly with the vision that we had laid out in Rebuild and Reimagine. Districts formally adopted this plan and we're preparing to move forward with it. But the context has continued to shift. And schools opened in a different context than we were expecting with the resurgence of the Delta variant and staffing challenges and declining enrollment and now kind of democratic and cultural issues playing out within schools and districts. And so I think we really are at a place now where we need to reevaluate. We're looking at a new phase of this very long-term crisis. And as we think about how we proceed as a community, I think we first need to ask the question, what are the changes that we need to see in the system? And then where are those leverage points where research can play an important role? And I'm hoping that that's something that we can continue to talk about throughout today's conversations and into the happy hour as well. So thank you.